not even recording. And the hashkafa pratis of this setup is that the parasha this week is the parasha of Yisroi, which is the parasha of the giving of the Torah. And the 6th chapter of Pirkei Avos is nicknamed Kinyan HaTorah, because the entire focus of the 6th chapter of Pirkei Avos is a whole series of brises, and we'll talk about what brises are, maybe not today, maybe next time, but they're all on the theme of how a person goes about successfully acquiring Torah, and of course the importance of acquiring Torah. So Kinyan HaTorah, it's all about getting to that point that we truly understand and learn the Torah properly. So that's why today's introduction is going to be so valuable. Straight out of the parasha. Parashas Yisroi is the parasha of the giving of the Torah. When it comes, and you've heard this I'm sure many times, and when it comes to describing how the Jewish people got to stand at the foot of Mount Sinai in order to receive the Torah uses grammar that is apparently out of place. What's out of place about the grammar? Vayichan, right? It's in the singular. So you're talking about 2.5-3 million people. And it says Vayichan, and he camped, Vayichan Sham Yisrael, and he, the Jewish people, camped there, Neged Hahar, opposite the mountain. What's the significance of the fact that it's in the singular? Vayichan in the singular. You've heard this dozens of times. Is that they were Ke'ish Echad Belev Echad. They were like one person with a single heart. In other words, absolute unity. Now you've heard this many, many, many times. And that's the problem. Because when we are so familiar with something, that's usually when we misinterpret it. Because we've heard it so many times that we don't necessarily pay attention to the entire statement. So who taught us this? That Ke'ish Echad Belev Echad, that they stood there like one person with one heart. Where have you read it? Where did you come across it? Ke'ish Echad Belev Echad. Rashi. Exactly. Rashi's commentary on the verse. Except that that's not how Rashi says it. I mean, he does use those words, but that's just picking out a segment of what Rashi says. That's not the full comment of Rashi. So what does Rashi say? Listen to this. Rashi says, Vayichan Sham. Rashi picks out that the word, there's an apparently superfluous word in the verse. Sham, there. There is an exclusion. That means everywhere else they did not share this experience. There, at the foot of Mount Sinai, that's where they stood. Ke'ish echad belev echad, like one person with one heart. Aval shar hamasois v'chanoyos, but all the other travels and all the other encampments during the course of 40 years in the desert, those were with discord and dispute. So, what's the message? We always focus on the fact that when they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, there was this incredible unity, which is true. But the full message doesn't seem to be so encouraging. Because the full message says, and everywhere else, they were fractured. And the obvious reason for that is because everywhere else, they are referred to in the plural. Vayisu, and they traveled from point X. Vayachanu, and they camped in point Y. So are we highlighting the unity at Sinai, or are we, God forbid, highlighting the disunity everywhere else? Okay? So I'm saying, but are we highlighting the disunity, or are we highlighting the unity? Now that's Rashi. I just want to point out that Rashi typically, obviously, bases himself on other earlier sources. And in this case, it would appear that Rashi's based his commentary on the Mechilta, which is one of the Midrashic sources. Except the Mechilta says it a little differently. The Mechilta says it, well, a little differently. Actually, the Mechilta says it almost the opposite way around. The Mechilta says, everywhere that they went, whether it was traveling or camping, it was with discord. And when they came to Sinai, then it was with unity. Can you hear the difference? Rashi is saying, here there was unity. And, by extension, everywhere else was discord. Whereas the Mechilta says, everywhere was discord, but here there was unity. Now you've got to try and work out, they apparently are saying the same thing, but they actually don't sound like they're saying the same thing. So what's the difference between these two views? And understanding the difference between these two views will help us to appreciate the greatness of the unity that occurred at Sinai. And obviously we're going to have to ask the question, why Sinai? What happened at Sinai that created this tremendous unity? Now you probably already have worked out the answer to that question, right? What brought about the unity at Sinai? We'll see. So let's see, what's the distinction between the Mechilta and Rashi? Now we know that the difference between Rashi's commentary and Midrashic commentary is, what's the big difference between Rashi and a Midrash? Rashi is Pshat. In other words, every single commentary that Rashi has on the entire Torah is always designed to fit with the simplest understanding of the words. Midrash is not necessarily that way. There is no rule about Midrash that says it has to be literally understood. And that's actually what Midrash often does. It takes things out of their literal context. So now, when you look at the words that the Mechilta uses to describe this discord, this tarumes, this meriva, the conflict that it describes, if it's the Midrash talking, then we could use words like discord quite broadly. Whereas if it's Rashi using those words, he must be using them literally. In other words, Rashi is saying that there, at the foot of Sinai, there was a unique unity, in spite of the fact that in other places through the 40 years in the desert, there was outright conflict. Now, we know that there was outright conflict. We just read in this past parasha that there was a place named in the desert, Masa Umeriva. That's what it was called. It was called the place of Meriva. You know what Meriva is in language we can relate to? Listen to the word, Meriva. Faribel, yes? That's where it comes from. So there was real conflict. There was actual rebellion almost against Moshe because they needed food and water and all that kind of, right? So Rashi takes it at face value, that if the Torah is talking about the plural in other places, it's because there were real conflicts in the other places. Whereas the Midrash is using the term more liberally, and the Midrash could simply be talking about different opinions, different views. Just because people behave the same way doesn't mean that they automatically think the same way, right? We know that. How does the Gemara put it? The Gemara says, "Keshem she'ein partzufeya, keshem she'partzufeya shoynois." Just like every person has a unique face, kach de'oiseya shavos. Each person has a unique outlook, a unique perspective. So this business of trying to get everybody to be homogenous in their thinking is not realistic. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. We're not, how do they say? 2 Jews? 3 opinions, at least. I don't know who said 3 opinions. I have a different opinion about how many opinions. Right? So we know that if you put a whole bunch of Jewish people together in an environment, there are going to be multiple opinions. Have a look at the Gemara as an example. We're going to circle back to this. The whole style of the Gemara is different opinions. So, according to the Midrash, where words do not have to be used absolutely literally, it's quite possible that the Midrash is saying throughout the whole time the Jews were in the desert, they had various opinions even when they behaved, even when they followed what they were supposed to do. They still retained their unique opinions, and sometimes those opinions were different to the opinion of Moshe. But here at the foot of Mount Sinai, something unique happened. They were ke'ish echad, not just unified as a person, moving in a single motion, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, but belev echad, there's the significance, they shared the same sentiment. That's a big deal. That's unusual. That everybody's in the same place emotionally, intellectually, that's a big deal. Question is, why? What happened? What happened at the foot of Mount Sinai that brought about this tremendous unity between the Jewish people? Now, you know the answer to that question, obviously, right? What's the answer? The Torah. That's why it's Neged Ahar. It's across the mountain of Sinai. Because they're here now to receive the Torah, that's what creates this unique unity. So, we're about to start the chapter about Kinyan HaTorah, which is all about the value and the process that a person is supposed to go through in order to acquire Torah. Well, here's our introduction, because clearly one of the key factors of Torah is its capacity to unite. The Torah is telling us that. Ke'ish echad b'lev echad. Vayichan. There in the singular, the one time that everybody is 100% on the same page. Not only are they not fighting with each other like Rashi says, they don't even have disparate opinions like the Midrash says. They're in absolute harmony and unity. When? At the time of the giving of the Torah. That is a clue that what the Torah does for us is the Torah creates absolute unity. So, before we go any further, let's ask the question, does it?
Why are there so many opinions in the Gemara?
Why are there so many opinions in the Gemara? I mean, you can't turn more than 2 pages in the Gemara without having at least one debate. Okay. Abaya and Rava, Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Shimon, and not to mention, of course, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. So, our classical sources, where we're speaking about Torah being this voice of unity, is actually a place of huge diversity.
But not really, because it's based on the...
It's based on?
The Torah.
Good. So, what you're going to say then is Rashi's view. Rashi's view is the Torah avoids the conflict. But what about the Midrash that says that the Torah synthesizes different opinions? The Torah is full of different opinions. And we don't only have to look in the Gemara, we can look beyond the Gemara. Because then you'll get in the Rishonim, you'll get the Rambam and the Raavad. The Raavad wrote his commentary with the sole purpose of trying to illustrate that the Rambam wasn't 100% accurate in every area of halacha, because he didn't want people to believe that you could just take one book and just learn it. What about, okay, it's not necessarily the same degree of argument, but Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isidish, who basically made parallel codes of Jewish law. And if you look at the commentators on the Torah, you'll always see distinctions between the various commentators on the Torah. Okay, let's make it more close to home. So, if I look on the bookshelf over here, and I look for a siddur on the bookshelf over here, yes? Which siddur am I going to find? I'm going to find a brown book. And if you come into our shul, you're going to find a blue book. And if you go to the Sephardi shul, you'll find the white book. And the truth of the matter is, even in our experience here, learning in our shiur, look how there were differences in where the Mishnah started and ended. Even there's debate. I mean, you phone somebody up and you ask a shayla, right? I've got an halachic question, and whatever it is, let's say it's a kashrus question. So very often, the response that you get is, they're different opinions. And then you could tear your hair out because you just want to know, what am I supposed to do practically? And then you get told, well, there's different opinions and it depends, and you got to do a whole research. So where is this vayichan? Where's this great unity and harmony of minds that is supposed to happen through the Torah in practice? If anything, Judaism seems very disparate. We won't even go into, we're lucky in South Africa, we've got a single kashrus authority, a centralized based in, it's a pleasure. You go to other parts of the world, this person won't eat at their brother's house. Right? Because everybody's got that. They follow this hechsher and that based in, whatever the case is. So where's this unity that we're talking about? That the greatness of Torah is that it brings us all into a sense of oneness. Or as the Pasuk says, Hashem oiz le'amoy yitain. Hashem gives strength to his people. Says the Gemara, Ein oiz ela Torah. When it says over here that Hashem gives us strength, it doesn't mean that Hashem gives us strength to be able to live through the rising anti-Semitism that's happening in our world. It means He gave us the Torah. That's what's going to help us to get through the difficult times. Our strength is Torah. How does the pasuk conclude? Hashem yivarech es amoy ba shalom. That Hashem blesses His people with peace. Or as we say, there's a brisa that we quote daily in our davening. That Torah scholars are the people who increase peace in the world. Have you ever walked into a yeshiva? Does it sound like a peaceful environment? Where everybody is yelling at each other, you don't understand the pshat, I do understand the pshat, you've got to check this toisus, yes, but there's that riff. Where's the shalom? Not only that, the Gemara tells us, Loi nitna Torah, the Torah was not presented Ella for any other reason but La'aseh shalom ba'olam, to bring peace into the world. So Vayichan, this concept of this oneness that is supposed to occur when they're standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, is clearly a theme right throughout the Torah in theory, and it does not appear to be the experience that we have of Torah in practice. So how do we reconcile the two?
For the sake of heaven, no?
For the sake of heaven doesn't make it harmonious. It just makes it respectful.
But maybe you know what it is. When Hashem blessed Abraham when he was sacrificing his son, he said, "You will be like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore."
Right.
So that each person must shine his own individual light, but then he must be like a community.
Fine.
Like the,
So-
and that there can be, people can agree to disagree as long as it is that we are keeping the Torah.
So basically what you're saying is that, like the Midrash described, it is possible for people to behave in the same way and yet to have divergent opinions. And the Mechilta that we quoted says that is what was present everywhere throughout the 40 years in the desert, and is what changed at the foot of Sinai. That at the foot of Sinai, it wasn't only that they all served the same purpose, they all had the same orientation, they all had the same dedication. It's all that they had absolute unity. In the words of the Mechilta, they didn't even have different opinions. So now,
But does unity mean agreement? Necessary.
according to the Mechilta and its interpretation of Vayichan Sham Belev Echad, with a single heart, that's what it means. That everybody is literally in the same headspace. Again, according to Rashi, the simpler version of how to understand this, perfect. Where there was previously discord and disagreement, now at least everybody is, they treat each other well, they're harmonious, even if they have different views. But according to the Mechilta, where the rest of the time they were unified in behavior, but divergent in thought, and standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, they were unified in thought, and that's what Torah is supposed to represent, leaves us with a major question mark. How? Where? We've never, at least peripherally, don't seem to have experienced this. So, our first clue is going to be from the Gemara Shabbos. That tells us this. Believe it or not, the key to unity is not what everybody would think, the symbol of the number 1, because that's what you would think is the symbol of unity. Rather, the symbol of unity is the number 3. How does the Gemara tell us this? Because it says as follows: Brich Rachmana, blessed is the merciful one, De Yahiv Urian Tlisai, who gave us a Torah that is made up of 3 segments: the Torah, Nevi'im, and Kesuvim, what we call the Tanakh. So he gave us a 3-part Torah, Al Yedei Tlisai, through the hands of the person who was the 3rd child in his family, Moshe, Le'am Tlisai, to a nation that is divided into 3 key segments, Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim, Be'yarcha Tlisai, in the 3rd month of the Jewish calendar, because the Jews left Egypt in the month of Nisan, and they were told, "Achodesh hazeh lochem roish chodoshim," this will be the beginning of your months. Then they had the month of Iyar, traveling through the desert. And when did they arrive at Sinai, in the Sinai desert? The Torah tells us, "B'chodesh hashlishi letzeis b'nei Yisrael mimitzrayim." Torah tells us clearly in this week's parasha that they arrived at Sinai in the 3rd month, and that's when they received the Torah. So clearly the number 3 is a very important number with regards to understanding what the Torah is about, because the Gemara is telling us it's a 3-fold Torah, and it's given to us by somebody who had number 3 in their family, and we're a nation made up of 3s, and it happens in the 3rd month. Now, immediately, any logical process is going to tell us, what? Why would 3 be the number of unity? Surely, the number of unity is 1. One is Hashem, yeah? That's how the song goes. That's what do we say in our davening? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. That Hashem is one. In fact, Yeah, exactly. We don't want to go there. But yes, there are other people who have this concept of three. Yes? Remember that everything that exists in the world of Tumah has to have a root in the world of Kedusha, otherwise it couldn't exist. So it doesn't come out of thin air. So what is this principle of three and where does it come from? Now, if you go back, for example, to the story of creation, we're told that the second day of creation is called the second day of creation, right? Vayerev vayiboker Yom Sheni. And the same for the third day, Yom Shlishi, the third day, Revi, the fourth day, etc. But the first day of creation is not called Vayehi Erev Vayiboker Yom Rishon. It's not called the first day of creation. Instead, it's called Yom Echad, the day of one, or one day of creation. And the Gemara tells us that the reason for that is because at that point, Yachid Haya Be'olamoi. At that point of creation, there is only Hashem. Nothing else has taken on form yet. So there's only Hashem in the world. So to us, that would be the symbol of unity, right? One. One is the symbol of unity. There's no alternative. We're all on the same team. We don't have anybody else. What's that meme that's been going around since October 7th? That we discovered that the rest of the world hates us more than we thought, and we love each other more than we thought.
But
right?
One is singularity, not unity.
Exactly. Correct. Exactly. It's exclusion. It's not unity. In other words, that's the meaning of the word yochid as opposed to echad, which is really what symbolizes oneness. Oneness is not an achievement. Oneness is just the exclusion of everything else. So if there's only Hashem and nothing else, that's not called unity, that's called exclusion or uniqueness. In order to have unity, there first has to be disparity. If there was no fracture, there is no concept of unity. To put it differently, shalom. What's shalom? I had this debate with somebody recently. Shalom, no, that's shalom, yes, but what is shalom? Just the direct translation. Direct translation of shalom is peace, yes? If there had never been any conflict, there would be no value to peace. For example, when a person says something about, I am at peace, that implies that previously they were in a state of some kind of turmoil. Because if there had been no turmoil, there'd be no value in saying, I'm now in a state of peace. I have peace of mind. So, Hashem yivarech es amoy ba shalom. Hashem blesses us with peace. The immediate implication is that peace indicates that there was first some kind of disparity. There was first some kind of tension. There was some kind of conflict. And the resolution of that conflict is what produces peace.
So then why not two?
Why not two? Good. So now let's look at the second day of creation for 1 second. What happens on the second day of creation? The number 2 is the number that represents separation, split, conflict. It is the number of conflict. Because until you have a second alternative, there is no space for conflict. And that's why Hashem does not use the word toiv about the second day of creation, because that's the day that machloikas was invented. Now, machloikas doesn't just mean conflict. Machloikas means division. Because the minute there's a division, there's the potential for conflict. If there's no division, there's no potential for conflict. So, 1 is the number of uniqueness. There is no achievement at that point. There's no achievement of unity because obviously, if there's nobody else, if there's nothing else, there cannot be unity. 2 is the number of conflict, which, by the way, is the number used to introduce the world. Bereshis. The world is created to be a place of disparity. That's how it's designed. Be with the letter Beis, implying the number 2. So we understand that the beginning of all existence as we know it starts with disparity. What is the purpose? The purpose is unity. Okay? In other words, had there been no conflict, there actually would be no purpose. The purpose is unity. How do you achieve unity? We can't, because we're stuck in the conflict. We need something that is greater than us, that is beyond the conflict, that can allow us that unity, that's the Torah. So why is the Torah given in the third month, and with this number 3 associated with it? To illustrate that we're not looking to reduce the world back to a place that it's echad, that there's nothing but Hashem. That's not the purpose. The purpose is Hashem created something else. He created a sheni. He created an alternative. He created a universe that believes itself to be real. And by real, we mean independent. And even if the universe doesn't believe itself to be independent, we certainly do.
Independent of Hashem.
Clearly. And the greatest proof of the fact that we believe ourselves to be independent of Hashem is that we occasionally make decisions that are misaligned with what Hashem wants. Obviously, it doesn't happen often. Obviously, present company excluded. So what is 2? 2 is the state of how Hashem created the world. 3 is the goal. And we'll talk about that in just a second.
I just wanted to ask, you say that you can't have peace of mind if you don't know conflict. But maybe academically you can know other people's conflict or not peace of mind, but you could still not have conflict.
Okay, so effectively what you're saying is that a smart person learns from their mistakes, and a smarter person learns from other people's mistakes. But the reality is, that's great in theory, except for the practical reality that we all have some level of turmoil in our lives, and it's our challenge to overcome our turmoil. So as much as we can learn from somebody else's inner conflict, ultimately Hashem gave us our particular flavor of conflict to allow us our particular type of shalom. So we have to be aware of that and accept that as a part of our reality.
So we have to align with Hashem.
And how do we align with Hashem? There's only one way to align with Hashem, and that is through His Torah. Okay. So now let's understand this principle of the third dimension. It's effectively 3D Judaism, right? So what is this third dimension? There's another brisa. Like I said, Pirkei Avos is brises. What is a brisa? Effectively, when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi started to compile important legal discussions in written form, because for 1,000 years, all information outside of the Tanakh was all passed on verbally from generation to generation. Now there was the invasion of the Romans, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, the dispersion of Jews all over the world. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi realized we're going to lose this information unless we record it. So when he started to record the legal conversations around pretty much every area of Judaism, that became known as the Mishnah. And in order for information to qualify to be included in the Mishnah, it had to be 100% letter verified. Meaning to say, no gray areas in the Mishnah. Every single piece of information that's recorded in the Mishnah is 100% letter perfect, generation from the previous generation all the way back to Moshe. There was other information by the same sages at the same time that had either differences of opinion about the wording, or sometimes even about whose opinion was whose, and therefore was not included in the Mishnah. And those became recorded separately, and they're called brisa, which comes from the word bar, meaning outside, Aramaic, outside of the Mishnah. Now the brisa has tremendous importance in our literature, in our history. It has a very high authority in terms of deciding legal issues. It's just not at the same level of authority as the Mishnah. So there's a brisa that we say on a daily basis also in our davening. Rabbi Yishmael teaches that there are 13 methods that you could use in order to interpret the Torah. And he goes through a whole list. Everybody knows the first 2 on the list because they're familiar to us. The kal vachomer, which is the legal application of an idea from a less severe case. So obviously it must apply to the more severe case. And a gezerah shava, which is something that you could only know if it was passed down by tradition, and that's how you can compare the same words in different verses to be able to understand a topic. Most of the others in between those first 2 and the last one, most people don't know what they are necessarily, and possibly don't even know them by name. The last one on the list that he records is as follows. V'chein shnei chsuvim. Likewise, if you have 2 verses in the Torah, hamachishim zeh, and the verses contradict each other. I'd like to point out that Rabbi Yishmael does not say the verses appear to contradict each other. He says the verses contradict each other. That is exactly what we're looking for. Disparity, conflict. And those two verses, he says, will remain in a state of perpetual conflict ad shebo hakosuv ashlishi, until we're able to identify a third pasuk, hamachria beineim, that could make sense of how we can harmonize the two conflicted psukim. So here's an example. We have a pasuk that tells us that when Hashem spoke during the time the Jews were in the desert, the voice of Hashem emitted from between the kruvim, right? The kruvim on top of the ark, the golden cherubs on top of the ark, that's where the voice emitted from. Now the implication, of course, is that if you want to hear Hashem's message, surely you need to be standing there in order to get the message. Then we have a contradictory pasuk that tells us that Moshe would stand outside of the Mishkan in order to receive the message. So now we have a contradiction. So that now sounds like Hashem's voice broadcasted out into the public space. And that seems to indicate that it wasn't only Moshe who heard Hashem's voice. So we have two contradictory psukim. The one says the voice is inside the Kodesh HaKadosh and the Holy of Holies. The other one is saying Moshe is hearing it outside. So we have a conflict until we have a third pasuk that tells us how the process worked. That the sound came from the Keruvim and then traveled to only Moshe's ears, despite the fact that he was standing outside of the Mishkan. So there's a great example, right? We have two psukim that seem to clash with each other until we have this third pasuk that gives us a completely different perspective. Let's translate that into language we could understand. So very often, people have debates about a whole host of different topics. And what happens when people have a debate, especially if it's a long-standing debate, at some point they want somebody to help them understand who's right. So the classic example of that is the husband and wife who go for marriage counseling. And after the first session, they both walk out of the therapist's office and they both turn to each other and they say, "You see? That is not a kasav ashlishi hamachria." That means that therapist has not yet succeeded in creating the harmony between the warring parties. But sometimes what happens is you have two people who have a debate and then they go to somebody who's an expert in the field and they say, "Who's right?" And the expert in the field helps them understand the topic in a way they've never understood it before, which allows them to appreciate that actually both views are valid.
Or wrong.
Yeah.
Or wrong, as the case may be. Yes. But the word machria implies that they harmonize. It is possible that the expert turns around and says, "Neither of you knows what you're talking about." But here we're talking about machria, how you bring them together. In other words, the reason that people tend to have debates is usually due to lack of knowledge. And when a person has a bigger picture, a higher perspective, that's when things start to come together.
Lack of understanding.
Lack of understanding.
Okay, so I've read in places that Ashkenazi and Sephardim look at things differently.
Correct.
Okay.
So there you go. Great example. Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Great example. So there you've got Shnei Kesuvim and Machishim. Basically, you've got two contradictory views of how we're supposed to practice custom. It touches on certain areas of halacha as well. So we need the kasav ashlishi. We need this higher view of Torah to help us harmonize them together. And we're going to talk about them in just a second.
So then neither one of them can say, "I'm right."
We're going to see. Hold on. We're going to see. We're going to see in 1 second.
But Hillel and Shammai.
We're going to see Hillel and Shammai. Great example. We're going to see. Before we get to any of that, I have to ask you a question. Would you agree that Torah is wisdom?
Yes.
You can see who's been learning here for a while. The people who didn't answer immediately, because you realize that this is a trap. Is the Torah wisdom? Yes, it is, because the Torah itself tells us, Ki hi chochmaschem ubinaschem le'enei ha'amim. This is your wisdom and your understanding that is so profound that in the eyes of all the nations they will acknowledge that this is your wisdom. Yet, the Gemara tells us, Chochma bagoyim tamin. If somebody tells you that the other nations of the world are wise and they have great philosophies, believe that to be true. Because they do. Wisdom is not uniquely Jewish. All humans are capable of wisdom, and all societies and all cultures bring tremendous wisdom to the world. Torah ba'goyim. But if somebody tells you that the nations of the world are teaching the values and the philosophy of Torah, al tamin, don't believe that. Why? Why is it not possible for some great philosopher from a different culture to come up with ideas that are Torah-like ideas? Now you tell me, how often does it happen that something becomes the new fad and everybody's into it, and then they tell you, it's aligned with Torah values? And to be honest, every time I hear that, my stomach churns. Aligned with Torah values. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things that our community gets involved in. We say we're going to learn this and we're going to follow this practice and whatever, because it's aligned with Torah values. We need to understand that there's a major difference between wisdom and Torah. That's why when it's described in the Torah, it doesn't say ki hi chochma ubina le'enei ha'amim. It doesn't say it is wisdom and knowledge or wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations, but rather yi chochmaschem. It is it's a possessive term. It is your unique wisdom, ubinaschem, and your unique understanding that the rest of the world stands back and says, that is different. That is completely unique. How so? In Judaism, names are extremely important. We did not call the body of Jewish knowledge, we did not call it chokhmah, which is wisdom. We called it Torah, which is instruction. Instruction. Right? Moireh Hoira'ah, which is the correct name for a rabbi. Moireh Hoira'ah is somebody who gives instruction to the community. This is how you're supposed to behave. And what's unique about the Chokhmah of Torah is, and this is really important, that the Chokhmah of Torah can never remain theory. It always has to have Torah and instruction. That means, for example, a person could be a great medical scientist, and based on their scientific knowledge, they could tell you all the medical science about what foods you should eat and what foods you shouldn't eat. But there's nothing in that medical science that tells you you are required, you are obligated to follow what I say. No. My job is to advise you based on the information I have. You get to make a choice whether you follow me or not. Now imagine a rabbi who gets up in shul and says, the Torah says X and Y. I'm not telling you what to do. That would not be a rabbi. That's not a moireh hoira'ah. Because the objective of Torah is that it has to translate into behavior. That's why, if you have two different opinions in the Torah, take Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai as an example, it's all very well for them to debate and to argue, but at the end of the day, we have to decide a way to apply this that follows only one of the opinions. You can't have multiple versions of how Judaism operates. There's got to be a singular opinion. So, for example, most of the time we follow the view of Beis Hillel. So what does Beis Shammai do? They follow the instructions of Beis Hillel. So much so that we're told, the Gemara points out, the greatest thing about Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, besides the fact that they debated just about every topic in Jewish law, is the fact that they allowed their children to marry each other's children. Because they had debates about how marriage and divorce work. Which means, technically, abstractly, according to the one side, the other way of doing weddings was invalid. And yet they allowed their children to marry. Why? Because Torah is machriya. Torah takes two different opinions and says, you are welcome to debate those opinions, but in practice, we all have to be on the same page. So yes, a Sephardi and an Ashkenazi may celebrate Pesach differently, but neither of them is allowed to eat chometz, and neither of them chooses a different date for Pesach. There's a famous story, Gemara Rosh Hashanah, about Rabbi Yeshua, who made a calculation. He was a brilliant scientist. He made a calculation based on which Yom Kippur, in his opinion, was one day different to Rabban Gamliel, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, who decided when Yom Kippur was going to be. So Rabban Gamliel sends a message to Rabbi Yeshua, and he says, the date that you had calculated to be Yom Kippur, on that date I need you to appear in my court with your walking stick and your wallet, so that it's a public statement that in spite of your opinion, we follow one Judaism. And that's what he did, obviously. Because that is the unity of Torah. The unity of Torah is we are welcome to have many, many, many different opinions, views, insights, perspectives. Absolutely. There's nothing in Judaism that says that we should all be clones. But when it translates into how we practice and behave, there's Torah achas lekulanu. Then we have one Torah that we all are supposed to follow. That's how Judaism works. So is there nuance? Yes. Are there customs? Yes. But Judaism doesn't change. It's the minute that somebody starts to change our practices that we say, that's no longer Judaism. But it goes deeper than that. Look at the story of Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Gamliel for a moment. Okay, so Rabbi Gamliel tells Rabbi Yoshua, I want you to pitch up at my court to show the whole world that it's not Yom Kippur. So how are you going to do this? You're going to come with your stick and you're going to come with your wallet. The distance that Rabbi Yoshua lived from Rabbi Gamliel is more than the distance you're allowed to walk on Yom Tov. Because there's restrictions, right? You can't leave the city limits more than 2,000 amos on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. So the very fact that Rabbi Yoshua would have traveled to get to Rabbi Gamliel on Yom Kippur would have already illustrated that he doesn't believe today to be Yom Kippur. Why did he need the extra paraphernalia? Come with your stick, come with your wallet. He's teaching us a really important principle over here. There are two ways that you could defer to somebody else's opinion. It happens all the time, right? It happens to us as well. Sometimes we go to the rabbi and we really want the answer to be X. And then the answer is Y. I just recently had somebody ask me a question where they're holding in their Yiddishkeit. I said to them, rather don't ask the question. Because you're going to ask me and they're going to tell you and then you're not going to listen. So what's the value in that? So very often we want the answer to be X and then we're told, no, the halacha is not the way we wanted it. So what do? Like good Jewish people, we say, okay, fine, I'm going to defer. This is the authority I'm going to follow. So do you think that that's what happened with Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? Do you think that that's what happened with Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel? Basically, Beis Shammai says, Beis Hillel, you guys have the majority vote, so you're obviously correct, so we're going to just defer to your authority. Or Rabbi Yeshua says to Rabbi Gamliel, you're the boss, you're the head of the Sanhedrin, you therefore have the support of the community. I actually am a brilliant scientist who probably knows astronomy better than you, but hey, I'm going to defer to you because you're the big guy. That's not how Judaism works. That's not Torah. That's not machriya. Machriya does not mean that you defer to authority, because guess what? Chochma bagoyim tamin. The wisdom of the world says that you have to have a practical way to live. So you've always got to decide protocols of how you're going to work out what the law is, and then people who don't like it still have to follow it. So you might not like the speed limit, but it's not optional. Or maybe here it is, but generally it's not optional. So what Rabbi Yeshua is doing here, and what Rabbi Gamliel is illustrating, Rabbi Gamliel is not trying to make a point to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Gamliel is collaborating with Rabbi Yeshua to make a point to the Jewish community. I don't know if you've ever, God forbid, had to drive to a hospital on Shabbos. But if a person has, you know how uncomfortable that feeling is. To get into the car, to have to drive, hoping nobody's going to notice, and trying to minimize how many things you're going to do that break Shabbos. So suddenly you have people who drive without indicating, like make sure that you don't turn on the radio, and whatever those things. So have you ever, please God you haven't, person ever been in a Hatzara ambulance on Shabbos? They do all of those things. They don't cut any corners. They do all of those things. They use the radio, not the music radio, but obviously the communication radio. They're turning on lights, off lights. Why? Because when you know 100% that this is what you're meant to be doing on Shabbos, obviously they're not doing things that are not part of the requirement. But if this is what you're supposed to do, you do it. If the correct thing to do is to pick up the phone and call the emergency services on Shabbos, you don't put the phone on with your ear. You take the phone, you turn it on, you make the phone call so that it's clear that I'm embracing the fact that this is what the Torah says. I'm not just conforming. I'm not just accepting authority. I'm embracing it as my own. That's what Rabbi Yoshua is doing here with Rabban Gamliel's guidance. I'm not just deferring to the authority of Rabban Gamliel. I'm going to go back and I'm going to revisit my understanding of the Torah until I get to the point that I recognize that Rabban Gamliel actually was correct. Because the way that Torah works, it's not chokhmah, it's not just wisdom. It is something that requires Hashem's assistance. Like it says about King David. Hashem imo, it says Hashem was with King David. Says the Gemara, what does it mean that Hashem was with King David? Halacha kamoisoi, that when there was a legal decision to make, King David had the intuition to know the right way to paskin the halacha. Torah is not just knowledge, it is divine. And in order to access the divine, we have to be willing to embrace a different perspective that has been accepted as the halacha, even when our minds say that we understand differently. So Rabbi Yoshua comes with his stick, with his wallet. What's he illustrating? For me, I'm 100% comfortable with the fact that today is not Yom Kippur. When the law is decided in favor of Beis Hillel, and now Beis Shammai has to follow that law, they embrace it. Beis Shammai goes back. They relearn the entire principle until they see clearly why this is the halacha. That's machriya. That's the unity of the number 3. It's not the unity of compromise. That would be the number 2. There's 2 views, and we compromise in terms of what we should do practically. It's not the oneness of there being no disparity. There are different views and opinions. It's taking those different views and challenging ourselves after we have had a different view to revisit the Torah and say, why is this the halacha? Why is it that the way I understood it is not the way it should apply in practice? Remembering, Torah is instruction. It's all about how it plays out in practice. And I relearn until I resonate with the way that it's supposed to be in practice. That's Vayichan. That's the unity that happens when the Jews are sitting at the foot of Mount Sinai. And according to Rashi, it's that they overcame their actual differences. But according to the Mechilta, it's deeper than that. They actually overcome different views because the Torah allows us the opportunity to understand fully in a particular way and then to relearn and revisit and understand which is the correct way to understand. And that is Kinyan HaTorah. That's how we come to acquire Torah. We're going to learn about this obviously in the Pirkei Avos. We come to acquire Torah first and foremost with the trait that Beis Hillel had. Beis Hillel, we're told, were the most humble of the sages. Therefore, they were always willing to defer, and ironically, that's why most of the time everybody had to defer to them.